Millionaire walks away from his family on Christmas. But what he discovers the next morning will shatter everything he thought he knew about love, guilt, and second chances. Eduard slammed the car door, his mind already back at the office, not the house he had just left. Another Christmas, another promise he wouldn't keep. His wife, Diane, had already mentioned her plans for the holidays, but he didn't hear her. She never understood how important this deal was. Not just to him, but to their future. His phone buzzed, a reminder about the meeting he was missing by not being at the conference. His hand hovered over the screen. Diane would call. She always did. But he couldn't afford distractions right now. He glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing the lights of the house fading as he sped down the road. At home, Diane was wrapping presents for the kids, her hands slow and deliberate as if she had all the time in the world. She wasn't angry. She had stopped expecting anything else. "Diane." Eduard's voice came through the phone, sharp as always. "Yes." Her response was simple, but he could tell she was waiting for something, an apology, maybe, or an excuse. He didn't have either. "I'm heading out of town for the retreat. I'll be gone for the whole weekend." His words hung heavy in the air. "I know," Diane replied, her voice calm but distant. "You got a lot to do." There was no reproach, no desperation in her tone, just resignation. He hated that about her. She never argued, never pushed. It made everything easier for him, sure, but the silence between them had been growing louder over the years. She didn't challenge him anymore, not after everything he'd built for them. "All right, I'll be back by Monday," Eduard said before hanging up. The words felt hollow. He could already hear the kids asking for him, and Diane would probably be dealing with it alone. But there was work to be done. He couldn't afford to waste time on trivial things. Diane let out a long breath as she set the phone down, staring at the screen where her husband's name still flashed. She turned toward the tree in the corner of the living room, the glow of the lights reflecting off the carefully placed ornaments. Christmas would come and go, as it always did, and he'd be gone. She knew the drill by now. Eduard was always busy. Too busy for them. Too busy for her. She wiped her hands on her apron, checking the time. The kids would be home soon, and they deserved a Christmas like any other. She didn't want them to know what was really happening. Not yet. The door opened, and their daughter, Emily, rushed inside, her face flushed with excitement. "Mom, can we put the star on top of the tree this year?" "Of course, sweetheart," Diane said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Emily and her younger brother, Max, ran around the house, getting ready for the Christmas dinner. Diane watched them, trying to ignore the growing ache in her chest. Every year, she played the role of the cheerful mother, the devoted wife. Every year, she swallowed the loneliness, pretending everything was fine. But this year was different. She had known for months that something was wrong, something more than just Eduard's growing distance. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "You don't have much time left. Make the most of it." But she couldn't bring herself to say it, to tell Eduard. Not yet. He wouldn't understand. He never did. Eduard drove through the darkened streets, his mind still on the retreat. He could hear the quiet hum of the engine, his pulse steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. Another year, another Christmas without real connection. Without her. Diane's voice echoed faintly in his mind, but it was already fading. He couldn't let his thoughts linger on her, on the kids. Not tonight. He pulled into the parking lot of the luxury hotel, his phone vibrating again. This time, he ignored it. The retreat would start soon, and he needed to focus. The deal came first. Always. At home, Diane set the table, her hands moving mechanically. The lights twinkled on the tree, but they didn't bring her any peace. She felt the weight of her secret, a burden she carried alone. Eduard wouldn't be here, and it wouldn't matter. She was already used to the quiet. She only wished it didn't hurt so much. Diane looked at the clock again. The kids were finishing their dinner in the kitchen, their laughter echoing through the house, but it felt distant, like the sound of a life she once knew but couldn't quite reach anymore. She adjusted the place settings, carefully folding the napkins, her hands moving without thinking. Every little detail had to be perfect. It was the one thing she could control, the one thing that felt real. Max, their youngest, came running in, his face lit up with excitement. "Mom, Can we open one gift now? Diane smiled and nodded, pushing the knot in her throat down. All right, but just one? Max tore into the wrapping paper with a fervor only a child could have, and Emily stood behind him, watching her younger brother with a mixture of patience and joy. She was old enough to understand that Christmas had become a quieter affair, but she still held on to the magic of it, the idea that family meant everything. Look, Mom. Max held up the toy car he'd been asking for. His joy was contagious, and Diane felt a small surge of warmth, her heart swelling with love for him. She reached out and ruffled his hair, smiling for him, even though a part of her knew she wasn't really there. Her mind drifted back to the conversation with Eduard. She had known it would end up like this. He always chose work over family, always had. But tonight, in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the thought that something bigger was slipping away. Maybe it always had been. She pushed the thought aside. It wasn't for tonight. Tonight was for them. For the kids. They needed her to be strong, to show them that everything was okay, even if she wasn't sure anymore. Eduard's retreat had turned into a marathon of meetings. He sat in a high-end conference room, the gleaming glass windows offering a view of the city below, but his mind was a million miles away. The only thing he could focus on was the work in front of him. New contracts, expansion, everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. The retreat was supposed to help him refocus, but it had only confirmed what he had been ignoring for years. That work was all he really had. And yet, the emptiness was undeniable. His phone buzzed again, but this time, he couldn't ignore it. The screen lit up with Diane's name. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before answering. Diane? His voice sounded clipped, even to him. I'm just calling to check in, she said softly. There was no hint of accusation, no demand for anything. She never did that anymore. I'm busy, he replied, immediately regretting it. But, how are the kids? They're fine, she said. Diane's voice wavered, but she quickly recovered. Emily's excited about tomorrow. Max is too. It's quiet here, but we're managing. There was a long pause. Eduard could feel it, a space growing between them, growing wider with every word. The weight of his absence hung over her like a thick fog. You should be here, Diane said, her voice barely audible. He closed his eyes, guilt tightening in his chest, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. He wasn't sure what he could say that would make any of it better. We'll talk when I get back, he said, his words hollow. Enjoy the night. The line went silent, and for a moment, he almost wished she had said something more, something to pull him back. But she didn't. She never did. Eduard ended the call and shoved his phone into his jacket pocket, standing up to grab a drink from the bar. His reflection in the mirror caught him off guard. He was older than he remembered. Tired. Empty. Diane set the kids to bed after they had finished their small Christmas celebration, their giggles and sleepy protests filling the house as she tucked them in. Once the house was quiet again, she sank onto the couch, her shoulders heavy. She knew she couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. The phone call had only solidified it. The loneliness in Eduard's voice had struck her in a way nothing else could. He wasn't just absent physically. He was absent from her life entirely. She reached for the envelope she had been keeping hidden for weeks. The letter from her doctor. The words she had never spoken aloud. The words that she knew would change everything if Eduard ever knew. But she couldn't bring herself to show him. Not yet. Not when it would only drive the final wedge between them. A tear slipped down her cheek as she folded the letter again, hiding it under the cushions. She could only hope that, somehow, things would change. That Eduard would see, before it was too late, that there was more to life than business deals. That he would see the cost of his absence. But part of her was afraid that he never would. Eduard sat in the lobby of the luxurious hotel, watching the city lights sparkle below. The retreat had stretched into another endless meeting, one after another, each more draining than the last. His mind kept returning to Diane and the kids. The house so quiet and lonely. His own role in that silence gnawed at him. But it wasn't enough to make him turn around. He took a sip of his whiskey, the glass cool in his hand. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now. There was a deal on the table that could make or break everything. Years of work, of sacrifice. "Eduard, you still with us?" His colleague's voice pulled him back. It was one of the senior partners, a man named Charles, who had long ago made peace with his own neglect of family life. He glanced at Eduard, waiting for an answer. Eduard forced a smile, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes anymore. "Of course, just thinking about the presentation." "Well, let's keep that focus then," Charles said, clapping him on the back. "You're too important to let something like Christmas distract you." Eduard nodded, but inside, the words felt like a punch to the gut. Something in him stirred, a vague discomfort that he quickly pushed aside. He couldn't afford to let this retreat turn into a guilt trip. Diane and the kids would manage without him. They always did. As the meeting continued, Eduard's phone buzzed again. "Diane." He glanced at the screen, hesitating. He could feel the guilt creeping in, but he swiped it away and put the phone face down. He couldn't afford this right now. Back at home, Diane lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The quiet was suffocating. The kids had fallen asleep hours ago, their peaceful faces framed in the dim light from the hallway. It was the first time all evening that she had allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loneliness. It wasn't just the absence of Eduard. It was the crushing realization that, even when he was here, he wasn't really here. He hadn't been for a long time. She closed her eyes, but the exhaustion didn't come. Instead, she thought about what the doctor had said, the prognosis that hung over her like an unspoken threat, the timeline that had been given to her, the reality she couldn't escape. She wanted to tell Eduard. She wanted him to understand. But how could she, when he didn't even see her anymore? When he was so absorbed in his own world that her own suffering was invisible to him? It hurt more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. She had tried for so long to be everything, to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the strong one. But that had only led her to this point. She was alone, and the weight of it was unbearable. Eduard returned to his hotel room late that night, feeling drained. The last of the meetings had dragged on longer than expected, and his mind was clouded with numbers, projections, and strategies that had nothing to do with what really mattered. The hotel room was as sterile as the rest of his life. He kicked off his shoes and sank into the chair by the window. His phone sat on the desk in front of him, still face down. He knew Diane had called again. The thing was, he didn't know what to say to her. He never had. She was so patient, so understanding. But what did that really mean? Was she truly okay? Or was she just pretending like he had been for years? He grabbed the phone and opened the messages from her. Just simple updates, nothing too important. But there it was, her final message. "I'll be here when you get back. Merry Christmas, Eduard." A lump rose in his throat. He stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide if he should call her. But he didn't. He couldn't. He wasn't ready to face whatever this was between them. Diane had already made her decision. It wasn't a decision born out of anger or resentment. It was born out of necessity. She couldn't keep waiting for Eduard to wake up to see what was happening. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when, deep down, she knew it wasn't. She had put it off for too long. But now, the truth was catching up to her, and the time to tell him had come. The letter was in her hands again, the one she had kept hidden for so long. She read the doctor's words again, but this time they didn't bring the same panic. There was no point in being afraid anymore. She had already lost what she needed most, Eduard. And so, as the silence of the house pressed in on her, Diane made up her mind. She would tell him. She would make him understand. Eduard stared at the cold reflection of himself in the window, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass. He didn't know what to do anymore. The retreat hadn't given him clarity. In fact, it had done the opposite. It had only amplified the emptiness that had been growing inside him. He was a success, yes, but at what cost? For the first time in a long while, he questioned the path he had chosen. Diane couldn't sleep. The letter felt heavy in her hands. Each word on the page a reminder of what she was about to lose, what she had already lost. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound in the dark house, as if the world outside had paused, waiting for her next move. She had spent years covering for Eduard, shielding him from the reality of their lives. She had always told herself that he was working hard, that one day things would be different. But now, as she sat in the stillness of the night, The harsh truth was undeniable. She had been alone for too long, and it wasn't just the distance between them. It was the weight of a future she no longer had the strength to ignore. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. Christmas, a time for family. But what did that even mean when the family she had built felt like a distant memory? Her phone sat beside her, silent, its screen dark. She hadn't heard from Eduard all evening. The messages, the missed calls, always excuses, always promises he never kept. At this point, she couldn't wait any longer. She stood up, crossed the room, and grabbed her phone. The words she had rehearsed in her head for weeks suddenly felt inadequate. How could she explain it all? How could she make him see what she had known for so long? She opened a new message and started typing. Eduard, I need you to listen. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I can't do this alone anymore. I'm not asking for anything, just the truth. Please come home. Her fingers hovered over the send button. The weight of the message felt like an impossible burden, as if hitting send would open a door she couldn't close. She wasn't ready. She had never been ready, but she pressed it anyway. Eduard's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. Diane. His heart skipped a beat, but he didn't answer. He wasn't ready for whatever this conversation would bring. The guilt had already started to settle in, and the last thing he needed was another round of her disappointment. He stood in front of the window, watching the city stretch out before him. The lights below looked so far away, as though they didn't belong to him. The weight of the retreat, the promises he'd made, all of it felt hollow. He took a deep breath and finally looked at the message from Diane. Eduard, I need you to listen. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I can't do this alone anymore. I'm not asking for anything, just the truth. Please come home. His pulse quickened as the words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know what to do with them. She was asking for something more than just an apology. He had been expecting her to reach out in frustration, to demand things from him. But this was different. It felt final. He ran his fingers through his hair, the weight of his own decisions pressing down on him. How had it come to this? How had he allowed himself to slip so far away from everything that mattered? Eduard stood there for a long time, staring at the message, unsure if he could even respond. Every answer felt insufficient. What could he say that would change anything? Could he make it better now? Could he fix the distance that had grown between them? Finally, he reached for his phone. He typed a response, but before he could press send, the words seemed to slip away from him. I'm not sure I can fix this. The message felt like a confession. He deleted it immediately, but the truth still lingered in the back of his mind. Back at home, Diane was staring at her phone screen, waiting. She hadn't expected a response immediately. She wasn't sure she was even ready for one, but her heart clenched as the seconds turned to minutes, then to hours. She sat back down on the couch, her hands shaking slightly as she held her phone in her lap. She felt the weight of everything, her body exhausted, her mind racing with all the things she still hadn't said, all the things she might never get the chance to. The silence in the house felt deafening. Eduard walked the halls of the hotel aimlessly, the message from Diane still burning in his mind. The weight of the retreat, the meetings, everything that had been so important only hours before, now felt trivial. He had been so focused on success, on keeping everything afloat, that he had failed to see the cracks in his own life. And now those cracks were threatening to swallow him whole. The hotel lobby felt colder now, the bright lights more sterile. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that this was a turning point he couldn't ignore. But what was he supposed to do with it? His phone buzzed again. Diane's name. He stared at it for a long time before he finally answered. Eduard. Diane's voice came through, quiet but firm. There was a strange calmness in her tone. I'm asking you to come home. Her words hit him harder than he expected. I don't know what to say, Diane, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I've been so lost in everything else. I didn't even see what was happening between us. Diane's silence on the other end was thick with emotion. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but the pain was unmistakable. I'm not asking for an apology, Eduard. I'm asking you to see me, to see what I've been carrying alone. His chest tightened at the weight of her words. I can't do this anymore, Eduard. I can't pretend it's okay. I need you to come home. For good? Eduard sat down on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed to his ear as Diane's words hung in the air between them. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything he had been avoiding. He had heard her before, through the years, through the distance, through the silence, but this time it felt different. This time, her voice cracked with a finality he couldn't ignore. I need you to come home. For good. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time in a long while, Eduard didn't know what to say. His usual responses, apologies, excuses, reassurances, felt inadequate. He wasn't sure if there was anything he could say anymore that would fix it. I'm sorry, he whispered, barely hearing the words as they escaped his mouth. I'm sorry, Diane repeated, her voice raw. You don't get it, Eduard. You've been sorry for so long, but you've never really seen what this has been doing to us. To me. And now it's too late for sorry. Eduard flinched at the sharpness in her words. It was as if she had finally stopped holding back, finally allowed herself to say everything she had been bottling up for years. And in a way, it felt like a punch to the gut. He closed his eyes, trying to compose himself, but the silence that followed only deepened the heaviness in his chest. I don't know what I can do, he said softly. I don't know if I can fix this. I don't know how I can make up for everything I've done, for the time I've wasted. Diane's voice faltered, but she quickly steadied herself. I don't need you to fix it, Eduard. I need you to show up. I need you to be here. And I need you to understand that what I've been doing, it's not enough anymore. I can't do this alone. The words hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. They weren't about the work. They weren't about the money or the deals. They were about her. About them. Eduard opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just failing her. He was failing himself. Diane, he started, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been so caught up in everything, I didn't see what was slipping away. I didn't see you slipping away. The phone was quiet for a long time. Diane didn't say anything, but he could hear the soft, uneven breaths on the other end. He felt it, the space between them, vast and impossible to bridge. Diane set the phone down, the weight of the conversation lingering in her chest. She had known it would come to this. She had known that Eduard would never truly understand the depth of her pain until it was too late. But hearing him finally admit it, hearing him finally acknowledge what she had been trying to make him see for so long, made something inside her break. She had carried the weight of their marriage, of their family, for so long. She had done it for the kids, for him. But what about her? What about her own needs, her own heart? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't. Not now. She had to be strong for Emily, for Max. She had to show them that even when everything seemed broken, they could still find a way through. Eduard sat in the silence, the phone call still echoing in his mind. He had never felt so small, so powerless. He had spent so many years pretending that work and success could fill the void in his life, but the truth was staring him in the face now, and it was a truth he couldn't deny. He had failed Diane. He had failed his family. He glanced at the clock. The night was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to undo the damage he had caused. But there was one thing he could do, one thing that could perhaps begin to heal the rift between them. He grabbed his coat, the decision sudden but resolute. He couldn't stay in this hotel any longer. He couldn't keep hiding from the truth. Eduard walked to the door, but before he stepped out, he hesitated. He had been so sure of everything before, so certain that his work was the most important thing. But now, standing at the edge of this moment, he realized how much he had lost in the process. His family, Diane, the love they had once shared. He had a chance to change it. Diane stood in the living room, her back turned to the door, staring out of the window. She had long given up on waiting for Eduard to return. He had made his choice, and now it was her turn to make hers. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Eduard. I'm coming home. For a moment, Diane couldn't breathe. She stared at the screen, the words floating before her. Was it really possible? Could he really change? Could he really come back from all of this? A lump formed in her throat. She had been waiting for this moment for so long. But now, as it finally arrived, she wasn't sure what to feel. She put the phone down and turned away from the window. She would wait. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about her too. Eduard stepped into the car, the cold air biting at his skin. He hadn't even packed. There was no need for it now. His suitcase sat untouched on the bed in the hotel room, but his mind was already on Diane, on what he had done, on what he still might have a chance to fix. The car sped through the city, but it felt like time had come to a standstill. He didn't know what he would find when he got home. Was Diane waiting for him? Had she already made her decision, her mind made up long before he could act? He couldn't bear to think of that possibility. His thoughts wandered back to the years spent building his empire, chasing success, finding validation in every contract signed, every deal secured. He thought he had been building a future, but it turned out he had been constructing a wall that had kept him from seeing Diane's pain, her quiet strength, her tireless devotion to him and their family. And now that wall was crumbling. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced out of the window. Christmas lights flickered by in the distance, a sharp contrast to the heaviness in his chest. Was this the end? Or was it a beginning? Diane sat in the living room, the soft hum of the heater the only sound in the house. The kids were asleep in their rooms. The house as still as it had been for the last few nights. But this time, there was something different in the air. She could feel it. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just the quiet anticipation of what was to come. She glanced at the door. Would he walk through it? Would he come back to her, truly this time, with all of himself? She wasn't sure what she expected anymore. She had fought for so long, kept the family together, held everything in place. But now, as she sat alone, she realized she had never really asked for what she needed. She had always been the one to give, to understand, to endure. But how much could one person give before they were left with nothing? She looked at the clock. It was late, but her mind raced, her emotions tied in knots. What if it was too late for them? What if the years of neglect and silence couldn't be repaired in a few minutes, a few words? What if the truth that had been buried for so long was finally out of reach? Her phone buzzed on the table, and her heart jumped. Eduard. She stared at the screen, the weight of the message sinking in. I'm coming home. Her breath caught in her throat. He was coming, but would it be enough? Could they both face what lay ahead? Could they heal the wounds that had festered between them for so long? She looked at the kids, sleeping soundly in their rooms. They deserved more than this. They deserved a family. They deserved to see love, not just the empty shell of it. But was it possible for her to forgive? To let him back into her life after everything? Eduard's car finally pulled into the driveway. He sat there for a moment, staring at the house in front of him. The lights inside were dim, the curtains drawn. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, making you feel every mistake, every regret. He didn't want to face it, not yet, but he knew he had to. He had to face Diane, face the reality of their life, even if it meant confronting the truth about himself. He opened the door of the car and stepped out, the cold air stinging his skin. The door to the house was just ahead. He could see it, feel it. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, and took one last breath. He wasn't the man who had left days ago. At least he didn't want to be. But what if it was too late? Inside, Diane stood, her heart racing as she heard the faint sound of footsteps outside. She felt her pulse quicken, her chest tighten. Was he really here? She didn't know if she could be ready for this. Ready for whatever it was he had to say. She had spent so much time preparing herself for this moment. But now that it had come, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face it. The sound of the door creaked open. Eduard stepped into the house, his eyes searching the room for her. Diane was standing in the middle of the living room, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, they just stood there, neither one of them saying a word. Diane, Eduard finally said, his voice breaking the silence. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to make this right. Diane looked at him, her eyes full of questions, of confusion, of a pain that still hadn't gone away. You can't fix this, Eduard, she replied softly. You can't fix what you've broken, but maybe you can try to understand it, to see it for once. All of it. The words hit him like a slap in the face. They weren't accusations. They weren't demands. They were a plea for him to see her, to finally understand the weight she had been carrying for years. I didn't know, Eduard whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know how much I had been blind to. I was so focused on the wrong things, on everything that didn't matter. Diane swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill over. But you were never here, Eduard. You were never really here for me. For us? I know, he whispered, the guilt consuming him. And I don't have an excuse for that. But I swear, I'll try. I'll really try this time. Diane closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that things could change, that they could find their way back to each other. But there was still so much unknown, so much that couldn't be undone. I don't know if I can believe you, she whispered. The house was still, the soft sound of Diane's breathing filling the space between them. Eduard stood there, his eyes searching her face, trying to find the woman he had once known, the woman he had taken for granted for so long. But the face he saw now was different, harder, more guarded. She was no longer the woman who smiled through his absences, who forgave his failures without question. Diane. His voice trembled, but he steadied it. I know I've done things that can't be undone. I know I've hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But please, I need you to know that I'm here now. I'm really here. She looked at him with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. And what does that mean, Eduard? What does it mean for you to be here now? Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. Because I've waited for you for so long. I've carried this weight alone. I've kept everything together while you disappeared into your work, into your life that never seemed to include me. Her words stung, but they weren't unfair. Eduard's chest tightened, the weight of his neglect sinking in deeper with each passing second. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could fix everything by working harder, by making more money, by providing. But I forgot about the most important thing. I forgot about you. About us. Diane shook her head slowly, tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. It's too late for words, Eduard. Too late for apologies that come after everything has fallen apart. Too late for promises you've already broken too many times. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as he moved closer to her. Please, Diane, let me show you that I can change. Let me show you that I'm not just saying this because I'm scared of losing you. Although, God, I am scared. But I'm also saying it because I need to prove to myself that I can be the man you deserve. Diane took a step back, pulling away from him. I don't need you to prove anything, Eduard. I need you to be here, to be the man who is here for me, for this family. I need to know you're capable of showing up every day, not just when it's convenient or when you've run out of other distractions. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Eduard's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't seem to find the right words anymore. Diane was right. She had been waiting for him to see her, waiting for him to finally wake up to the life they had built, and the life he had nearly destroyed. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry, he repeated, though the words felt hollow now. I know that's not enough, but please give me a chance to do better, to show you I can be who you need me to be. Diane closed her eyes, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he could be the man he was promising to be. But the years of disappointment, the countless moments where she had hoped and prayed for things to change, only to see him slip further away, had left their mark. And now, standing before her, he seemed like a stranger, a man who had come too late to understand what he had lost. I don't know if I can trust you again, Diane said, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can open up to you after all this time. After everything that's happened, Eduard's heart sank. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm serious. I'll show you, Diane. I'll show you that I can be the man who stands beside you, not just the man who makes excuses. Diane didn't answer at first. She just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, as if protecting herself from the storm of emotions inside her. After a long pause, she finally spoke. I don't know what to believe anymore, Eduard, but I need to see action. I need to see you here, really here for once. Her words cut through him like a blade. He had always thought that providing for her, giving her everything he thought she needed, was enough. But now he saw, in the rawness of her pain, how much more he had overlooked. She needed him not just as a provider, but as a partner, as someone who would show up, who would be present, who would listen, not just to her words, but to the silence in between. "I'll be here," Eduard promised, his voice firm. "Every day. I'll prove it to you, Diane." But even as he said the words, he knew that it wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead would be long. The trust that had been broken couldn't be repaired overnight. And Diane's heart, though willing, was still bruised, still wary. She didn't reply. She only turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving him standing in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. Eduard sat at the table, his hands clenched in a fist as he watched Diane move around the kitchen. She was making dinner, something simple, but it felt like a ritual, a routine. It felt like a reminder of the distance between them. He watched her, trying to understand what she was thinking, but her face remained unreadable. The silence stretched out between them, thick with unsaid words, with everything that still hung in the air. After a while, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, but still cautious. "I don't know what's going to happen, Eduard. I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm willing to try for them." She nodded toward the bedrooms, where Emily and Max were sleeping. "For the kids, for the family we used to have." Eduard's heart ached. He had failed them. He had failed her, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when he could still fight for it. "I'll do whatever it takes, Diane. I promise you." The evening dragged on in a quiet heaviness, the sound of clinking dishes the only noise breaking the stillness of the house. Diane worked methodically, setting the table with a precision that spoke volumes about the walls she had built around herself. Eduard watched her, the silence between them now filled with the weight of unspoken things. He sat there, unsure of how to close the gap. Diane had been strong, too strong for too long. He had taken her strength for granted, believing that as long as he provided, everything would be fine. But the truth was clearer now than ever. He had never truly been there for her, not in the way she needed. His thoughts kept drifting to their children. Emily, still so young, still holding on to the hope that things would be okay. Max, a little older, more perceptive, he could sense the tension between his parents, even when no one spoke of it. Eduard shifted in his chair, trying to find the words that would make this better, the words that might rebuild the foundation they had once had. But nothing came. He could only sit there, feeling the chasm growing between them, and realize that the only way forward was to show up. To actually be there, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally, mentally, in every way she needed him to be. "Diane," he said quietly, his voice barely breaking the silence. "I don't expect you to trust me again overnight. I know that, but I'm here now, and I'll stay here. I'm going to do everything I can to prove it to you." She paused mid-step, her back still to him, her hand on the sink. She didn't turn around right away, and when she did, her eyes were tired, older than they had been the last time he truly saw her. The vulnerability was there, but it was guarded by a layer of hurt and years of disappointment. "Eduard," she said, her voice steady but low, "I want to believe you. I do. But for years, I believed you when you said you were going to change. For years, I believed every apology, every promise. And you always let me down." Her words cut through him. She was right, of course. He had broken her trust too many times to count. And now, as he sat in front of her, he realized that he wasn't just asking for her forgiveness. He was asking for something even harder, her belief in him, in their future together. He stood up slowly, walking toward her with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. Diane didn't move, didn't step back. She was waiting for him to show her that he meant it this time. "I don't deserve your trust," Eduard said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth, but he knew they were true. "But I'm not asking you to give it to me right away. I'm asking you to let me prove that I can be the man you need, the man I should have been all along." Diane looked at him, her eyes scanning his face, searching for the sincerity she had so longed to see. She had heard promises from him before, promises that faded when the next distraction came. But this time, she didn't know if she could let herself hope again. "I've been so alone in this, Eduard," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I've carried everything on my own, the kids, the bills, the house. I've kept it all together, even when I wanted to fall apart, even when I needed you more than anything. Eduard reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered just inches from her arm. I know, and I'm so sorry for that. I can't change the past, but I can be here now. I can help. I can be here for you, Diane. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Diane swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't let him see her like this, not yet. Not when she wasn't sure if he was really here to stay. She turned away from him, taking a step back, and for a brief moment, Eduard feared that she was closing him out again. But then she spoke, her voice softer now, tinged with a quiet strength. I don't know if I can just forgive you, Eduard, she said, almost to herself. But maybe, just maybe, I can let you try. I can let you show me that you're really here. Not just for a day or a week, but for the long haul. For us? Eduard nodded, a small flicker of hope igniting in his chest. He knew this wasn't a victory. He hadn't won her back yet, but he had taken the first step. He had shown her that he was willing to fight for them, and that at least was something. Dinner was quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was no longer the crushing weight that had hung in the air for so long. Diane was calm, almost detached, but Eduard could sense that something had changed. She was still testing him, still unsure if he would be there for the long haul. As they ate, he tried to make small talk, trying to bridge the gap, but the words didn't come easily. He was too aware of the space between them, of the way she avoided his gaze, of the way she quietly focused on the task in front of her. But he didn't mind the silence. The silence meant she was still here, still listening, still willing to give him this chance. Max wandered into the room, rubbing his eyes sleepily, and Eduard's heart clenched as he looked at his son. The child was growing up so fast, and Eduard had missed so much of it. He had missed so much of everything that really mattered. Dad! Max's voice was hesitant, unsure. Eduard looked down at his son, his heart full of regret. Hey, buddy, you okay? Max nodded, then hesitated, his eyes darting to Diane before meeting Eduard's. Is everything okay now? Eduard's throat tightened. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if everything would be okay, but he had to try. I don't know yet, Max, Eduard said quietly, but I'm going to make sure I'm here. For you, for your mom, for this family. I'm going to show you that I'm here to stay. Max studied him for a moment, then nodded, a small, tentative smile appearing on his face. Okay, Dad. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Eduard. It was a start. The days that followed were a mixture of small victories and moments of doubt. Eduard tried to keep his promises, showing up, being present, and doing the little things that he had neglected for so long. He helped around the house, spending time with Emily and Max, even taking an active role in the school projects that had always fallen to Diane. He could see the flickers of surprise in her eyes when he took initiative, but also the wariness. She wasn't letting go of her guard so easily, and he didn't expect her to. But there were moments when he could almost feel the warmth between them again. Moments when they could laugh together, or when they simply shared a quiet, peaceful silence. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but Eduard clung to those small, quiet signs. He knew they were building blocks, the foundation of something he had almost destroyed. It was late one night, as he helped Diane wash dishes, that he finally felt the weight of the years between them. The years of missed moments, of unspoken words. He was behind her, standing at the sink, his fingers lightly grazing hers as she reached for a towel. It was a simple touch, but it felt like a breakthrough. Diane, he said softly, breaking the silence, I know I can't undo everything. I can't take back the years I wasted. But I need you to know, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm going to keep showing you that I'm here. Even when it gets hard, she didn't respond right away. She just kept washing the dishes, her movements steady, almost mechanical. But Eduard could see her processing, could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself back. And for the first time, he realized just how much she had been holding on to for so long. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. Eduard, you have to understand that I don't just need you here for a day or a week. I need to know that when the hard days come, when life gets difficult again, that you're not going to pull away, that you're not going to shut me out and leave me to carry it all. He nodded, his chest tightening at the rawness of her words. I know, and I promise you, I won't leave. Not this time. I'll be here, for as long as it takes." There was a long silence as Diane finished drying her hands. Then slowly, she turned around to face him. Her expression was still cautious, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that resembled hope. "I don't know if I can trust you yet," she said quietly, "but I'm willing to let you try. I'm willing to let you prove that you're not just saying words." Eduard's heart clenched, but there was no bitterness in her words. It was just the reality of everything that had come before. She was still hurting, still unsure, but she was giving him a chance he had to earn. He reached out to her, gently brushing his fingers against her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin, the softness he had longed for. She didn't pull away, and that, in itself, was a small victory. "I'll prove it to you, Diane. I swear. Every day." She didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him, just for a moment, was enough. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, and for Eduard, it was everything. The next few weeks passed in a blur of careful conversations and cautious attempts at rebuilding. Eduard made a point to be involved in everything, from helping with the kids' homework to picking up groceries and even taking Diane out for dinner. A small but significant gesture. She didn't smile as brightly as she used to, but he could see that the walls around her heart were starting to crack. Slowly, tentatively, she was beginning to let him back in, but there were setbacks. Days when the weight of the past felt too heavy, when the doubts crept in. Nights when Diane would retreat to the bedroom, her mind racing with everything she had carried alone for so long. Eduard would stay on the couch, unable to push past the silence, unsure of how to reach her. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Eduard found himself sitting on the couch, staring at the empty space across from him. The house was quiet, too quiet, and he could hear Diane's soft footsteps as she approached from the hallway. She paused, standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. "Eduard," she said softly, her voice uncertain. "I need to ask you something." He looked up at her, his heart thumping in his chest. "Anything?" Her eyes held a question, but it wasn't one he could answer with words. She was asking him to prove it, to show her that he was really here, that he wasn't going to pull away when things got hard again. Diane walked toward him slowly, her movements hesitant. She stopped just in front of him, her eyes meeting his. "How long are you going to keep trying, Eduard? How long before you give up again? How long before you go back to being the man who disappears when things get tough?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. It wasn't an accusation, but it felt like one. It was the fear in Diane's voice that struck him the hardest. The fear that he would repeat the mistakes of the past. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I'm not going anywhere, Diane. I'm not going to give up on us. I'll fight for you, for this family." Her eyes softened, but the doubt was still there. The scars from their past couldn't be erased by a few words, no matter how much he meant them. But he could see, in that moment, that she was starting to believe him. She was starting to see that he wasn't just saying things to get her to forgive him. "I don't know if I can ever really trust you again," Diane whispered. "But maybe I can try. I can let myself try." Eduard squeezed her hand, a silent promise passing between them. He didn't have all the answers, but he would keep showing up. Every day. And maybe, in time, that would be enough. It was Christmas morning, and the house was filled with the quiet hum of the holiday. The tree stood in the corner, lights twinkling softly, and the scent of fresh pine mixed with a faint trace of cinnamon and cloves. The children were already up, their excited voices filling the house as they rushed down the stairs to see what gifts awaited them. But in the kitchen, Eduard and Diane sat in silence. There was no grand moment of revelation, no sudden change in the air. The tension, which had lingered for so long between them, was still there, though softer now, more manageable. They had come a long way since that painful confrontation weeks ago, but it wasn't a perfect story. There were no miracles, no instant fixes. The cracks in their relationship still existed, but so did the possibility of healing. Eduard watched Diane as she carefully placed the last plate on the table. She was still the same woman he had once known, strong, resilient, protective, but there was something else there now, something he hadn't seen before. something that came from the slow but steady rebuilding of trust. She was looking at him differently now, not with the cautious distance of before, but with a soft kind of hope. He stood up, moving toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. The kids would be back in a minute, their enthusiasm taking over the house. But for now, this moment, this quiet between them, was theirs alone. "Diane," Eduard began, his voice softer than usual, almost tentative. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but it felt like the right moment. "I don't have all the answers, and I'm not asking for everything to be perfect. But I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I will never take you or this family for granted again. I'm here, for good, not just in the easy moments, but through all of it, all of the messy, hard parts." Diane didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She simply reached out, her hand gently brushing his as if she was confirming what she already knew. That in this moment, there was no turning back for either of them. They had been through too much to go back to where they once were, but the future was still ahead of them. A future they would face together, one day at a time. "I know," Diane whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know, Eduard. I can see it now. I can see that you're really here. And I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take that next step with you." The words were simple, but to Eduard, they were everything. They were the bridge across the chasm that had once separated them, the first real step toward a future they could rebuild together. And then, as if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the hurried voices of Emily and Mac's mom. "Dad, look at what we got." Diane and Eduard shared a brief, meaningful glance, the weight of everything that had happened between them still present, but no longer overwhelming. There was joy, however tentative, in that look, a promise of something better. As the kids burst into the kitchen, excitedly holding up their new toys and presents, Diane smiled, genuine warm. And for the first time in a long while, Eduard felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. All right, he said with a laugh, bending down to hug both of them. "I see you two are already living your best Christmas morning. But hold on, before we start the gift exchange, there's something I want to say." He paused, his gaze lingering on Diane, who was watching him carefully, a small smile tugging at her lips. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. For once, the future didn't feel like an impossible mountain to climb. It felt like a path, rocky and uncertain, but one they could walk together. "I know I've messed up," he said, his voice strong and steady. "And I know I have a long way to go to make things right. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying. I want to make up for everything I've missed, and I want to be here for you. For all of you." Emily and Max, both still holding their new gifts, looked at him with wide eyes. They didn't fully understand the weight of his words, but there was something in the air, something that felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. Diane's smile deepened as she looked at him, and for the first time, Eduard saw her fully, no longer burdened by years of aloneness, but standing beside him, sharing this moment. "Let's start fresh," Diane said, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. Max jumped up, pulling his parents toward the tree, excited to dive into the Christmas morning chaos. But for a brief moment, Eduard and Diane lingered, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. They didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would still be challenging. But for the first time, Eduard felt that they were ready for it. The kids pulled them into the festivities, and Eduard's heart swelled as he joined in the laughter, the joy, the noise. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for now, that was enough. As the laughter filled the room, as the gifts were exchanged, and the day unfolded with the warmth of family, Eduard knew one thing for certain. They had survived the hardest part, and in time, they would rebuild, together. In the end, it's not about perfection, but about showing up. No matter how hard the road is, no matter how many mistakes you've made, it's about the courage to rebuild, to trust again, and to fight for those who matter the most, even when the past seems too heavy to carry. Eduard and Diane's journey teaches us that love and family are worth every sacrifice, every step forward, no matter how small. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, comment, and share it with those who need to hear this message. The power of a second chance can change everything. And if you believe in the power of love and redemption, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the soul. Together, let's keep the hope alive.